Americans don't trust each other, and that's a problem. Yeah, let's talk about that.
Focusing on winning arguments, we're teaching the basic fundamentals of sales and marketing and how we can use them to win in the world of politics, teaching you how to meet people where they're at on the issues they care about. Welcome to The Brian Nichols Show.
Well, hey there, folks. Brian Nichols here on The Brian Nichols Show, and thank you for joining us on, of course, another fun-filled episode. I am, as always, your humble host, and thank you for joining us, yes, live from our Stratus IP studios here in lovely Eastern Indiana. Don't let cyber attacks or outdated business technology put your company at risk. Learn more at briannicholsshow.com/Stratus IP. Stratus IP, business technology simplified. Well, folks, yeah, Americans, we don't trust each other today in our institutions as much as we once did. And it isn't just because of a few bad apples. It's a problem that runs deep in our culture. Ideological conflicts are increasingly fierce and partisanship is growing stronger. Heck, we're increasingly divided by political affiliation, and our distrust for each other has become so pervasive that it affects everything from our relationships to our work lives and more. But is today's decline in trust inevitable or avoidable? Are we caught in a downward spiral that must end in institutional decay or, God forbid, even civil war? Or can we restore trust throughout our shared social institutions here in America? To discuss that, we're going to go back to an episode in 2020 with Kevin Vallier, where we discussed his new book, Trust in a Polarized Age. Folks, please, if you enjoyed today's episode, well, do me a favor, stick around. I'll have some closing remarks at the end of today's episode. But with that being said, on to the show. Kevin Vallier here on The Brian Nichols Show.
Very, very glad to be on.
Very glad to have you. Kevin, you wrote a book, Trust in a Polarized Age, which I think it's fair to say this is, in fact, a very polarized age. And right now, there's a lot of Americans who I think are scrambling for answers. And I think those answers first come with, how can I trust my fellow neighbor? How can I trust the Republican or the Democrat on the opposite side of the kitchen table during Thanksgiving or Christmas dinner? So with that, right now, your book, I think, is coming at a perfect time with all the emotions and the strife we're seeing coming up here with the election. And candidly, we're recording here on October 27th, so we haven't seen the fallout of what happened. But this is airing here after your book is released on November 10th. And we obviously are facing a very trying time right now. So your book, again, comes at a perfect time. So let's start off here. I love to kind of introduce my audience to my guests by my guests being able to kind of tell their story. And I know in your intro email to me, you mentioned that you were one of the bleeding heart libertarians out there. And actually, I had Professor Steve Horwitz on the show.
Very good. Yeah.
Yes, and Steve actually,
co-bloggers.
Yes, so he hails from my neck of the woods up in northern New York when he was teaching at St. Louis University. It was great to meet another bleeding heart libertarian like Professor Horwitz. So let's kind of start off. What was kind of your path to libertarianism through this like bleeding heart mentality, but also kind of what got you?
Dear.
I know. Trust me, these are always the fun conversations. But also, how did that help progress to where you are as an academic at Bowling Green University?
I started getting interested in politics when I was 15 or 16. Starting around the late 90s with the impeachment thing. A lot of people had opinions on that in South Alabama where I was, and the school, they imposed a school uniform policy post Columbine in my public school, and I started thinking about liberty then. Like, there were these guys that killed these kids, but why does that mean that we all have to wear khaki and white now? Was it actually going to do any good? Was there any evidence that it would do any good? Or are they just bossing us around in order to sort of make others feel safe, but not based on any evidence? And, that was a kind of minor issue, relatively speaking, but that kernel of skepticism, right? That people are just imposing controls out of fear or desire to control other people, that there was no fundamental rationale behind any of it. That kind of stuck with me. I was a pretty serious Democrat. I worked on the Gore campaign. I was 17, so I couldn't actually vote for him. But I was reading Murray Rothbard's For New Liberty that fall. And because a friend of mine in the Conservative Leadership Association, which was a conservative libertarian alliance at Washington University in St. Louis, had given me the book. And it was just radicalizing me bit by bit. And I remember I was for Gore at the end because I hadn't read Rothbard's final chapter on environmentalism. And then I read it and I was like, okay, I was completely mistaken. So then I and some friends of mine started the WashU College Libertarians. And we became so numerous that we were all members of the conservative libertarian kind of group. And we were the only group, like in the country, conservative libertarian group in the country, that opposed the Iraq War. So someone who was an MA student at WashU when I was an undergrad was Dan McCarthy, who helped to found the American Conservative. We were all kind of thinking in terms of like there were some paleo conservatives, some libertarians. Everything had kind of fallen into place with libertarian political thought for me. And so I thought when I went to graduate school, in philosophy, because I'd majored in philosophy and in cognitive science at WashU, and I was interested either in going into philosophy of mind, so asking questions about the nature of consciousness, for instance, in particular, and intentionality. But I was also very interested in political philosophy. So I thought, well, okay, so what are like the best PhD programs that I can go to where I can learn, continue to think through libertarian questions, but that also be good in philosophy of mind. Well, the main place that came up was the University of Arizona. And I was hoping when I went there to work with Dave Schmitz or David Chalmers, who's one of the leading philosophers of mind, but Chalmers had just left when I got there. So I was lucky enough to get in. And about a year after I got there, Jerry Gauss, who later became my dissertation advisor, joined the University of Arizona. And Jerry's a classical liberal, but you wouldn't call him a libertarian. But I think he's actually the greatest classical liberal thinker of the 21st century. He wrote this book 10 years ago called The Order of Public Reason, which I think is the best defense of classical liberalism just about ever. I'm starting to teach it at my grad seminar tomorrow. But one of Jerry's hostilities, or one of his issues, was that with ideology. And he had this almost shared virtue with Socrates of whenever someone sounded certain of something, he'd just go in for the kill. And he was absolutely brilliant. In fact, he, Chalmers, and Roderick Long are the three smartest people I've ever met. And he, because a lot of your listeners will know who Roderick Long is. And Roderick is a good friend and wonderful. So what Jerry started to do was, he challenged all of his students to rethink their ideology, and he really challenged me to rethink it. And part of the issue was not so much that the libertarian conception of justice was false, but he asked a new question, and one that I'd never learned in libertarianism before, which was, well, assume that we're not going to convince most people that libertarianism is true. How do we live with people who aren't libertarians? What principles can we use to adjudicate our disputes? And Jerry had, along with Rawls in his later work, been working up this idea that was actually common in the social contract tradition, what's called public reason. And public reason liberalism endorses lots of sort of liberal rights, but what's distinctive about it is that it seeks to justify state coercion to a range of different perspectives. So the thought was, okay, well, what laws and policies can be justified not just to libertarians, but to conservatives and progressives? And you might think, well, not very much. And I think it's true, not a huge amount. There's a large amount of things that states do that can't be mutually justified to all. But what it came to mean for me, which is that there was a way of being a libertarian that was authoritarian, which seems like it's a paradox, right? But it actually isn't. For instance, I'll give you an example of good old Walter Block. I listened to him give a lecture after I was starting to think about these issues, and he said, well, what should we do in a libertarian society with people like Rosie O'Donnell who want to ban gun control or want to ban guns? And he said, well, they would be regarded as common criminals. Right. And I thought, if we started to treat all non-libertarians like that, right, libertarianism would suck. Right. There's a way in which we would have contradicted ourselves. And so my introduction to public reason was my attempt to think, OK, there's an authoritarian way of being a libertarian, but there's also this kind of better way where we take the perspectives of others seriously. Jerry actually had such a big impact on my thinking that he made me a lot less certain that the libertarian theory of justice was true. But in a book he wrote in 2016, The Tyranny of the Ideal, he actually argued, in contrast to the title, that open societies can benefit from people having strong commitments to justice. And so I started thinking, okay, well, it's good for me not to be authoritarian about my libertarianism, but it's also good in many ways to have a view about justice. And I still think libertarianism is that view. And it was that combination, that tension, that led me to Bleeding Heart Libertarians. So the idea was that elements of the welfare state, I think, can be justified to conservatives and progressives. And I think if libertarians say no redistribution at all, we're essentially saying we can't live on free and equal terms with non-libertarians, because everybody else thinks that at least some redistribution can be justified. I mean, there's a few cases in libertarianism where it's allowed. And so so the question I asked to libertarians is, how much of your conception of justice are you willing to give up to be able to live in cooperative relations with non-libertarians, right? How much are, and I thought, okay, we can't compromise on war, right? It's just out. We're basically pacifists with respect to war. Because modern states can't discriminate against not to kill the innocent. So I thought, okay, there's some places where we have to draw the line, right? But there's other places where, like, food stamps for moms who can't get milk for their kids, that's the kind of thing I think, okay, I can give on that. And so I thought, okay, there's some redistributive measures that can be justified even to libertarians on the grounds that while it's not ideal, while it is unjust to some degree, if we want to live with other perspectives, that's what we have to do. Mm-hmm. So that's how I passed through Bleeding Heart Libertarians. And a lot of my thinking from there on out was thinking, is it even coherent to ask the question of what it would mean to be trans-ideological? Like, to have a political order that treated ideology like we treat religion. Could there be any principle of ideological toleration? And I started to think about this question in light of political polarization, right? That we treat our political differences like we used to treat religious differences, right? And that many people, especially on the right, have replaced religious fundamentalism, which I don't really like that term, but I like what I'm about to say. We replace religious fundamentalism with political fundamentalism. Yep. And libertarians can get sucked into that too, though we're so used to being on the outside, we're usually a little bit better. So my thinking was, well, how do we reduce polarization without asking people to change their views? How would that even work? Well, we have to pursue policies that build trust between different perspectives. And so that's why I wrote Trust in a Polarized Age, is I was trying to think which institutions would do the best job at sustaining high levels of trust between ideological perspectives, both among people and the public at large, but also among people in government. This led to a kind of take on libertarianism that I think maybe some libertarians need to hear, which is that a generic blanket attitude of distrust in government can actually leave us with worse and more powerful government. We get an example. If we sow distrust in the Fed, what's the likelihood in the next recession? Is it more likely that we'll go to a gold standard, or is it more likely that we'll get ridiculous fiscal policy? Well, it's probably more likely, given what most people think, that we'll end up with ridiculous fiscal policy. So even though I do think it's reasonable to think the Fed at least makes many recessions worse, by talking about ending the Fed, what was the real alternative? Well, 1% of people would go for a gold standard, but everyone else is just going to go Keynesian, right? So like having so thinking in terms of like, what are our feasible options? What's going to happen if we win this argument? What's actually going to occur? And I'm not saying we should have the Fed in an ideal world. We should have a free market money. I still think that. In fact, a free market money would be really awesome in lots of ways. But again, given the question, we're not going to convince most people libertarianism is true. How do we live with them? That's what brought me to Bleeding Heart Libertarians, and that's also what brought me to read the book. But it doesn't mean that I think the libertarian theory of justice is false. It just means I have a different way of going about pushing for it, is what I would say to your listeners.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack there, and I think and it's awesome, because this is usually my job to like give the guests so much to unpack in one question. But you ended up kind of in your explaining of this idea of trust, right? Now, my day job, I'm a sales professional. I lead a sales team in telecom, and one of the things I'm always talking about is obviously trying to build rapport over the phone, but also trying to build trust. And building trust is one of the most fundamental key aspects in sales, because if you are not able to establish some fundamental basis of trusting one another, then everything that you're doing is completely null and void, because the underlying, really the foundation, the basement of the entire relationship isn't built on anything positive and lasting. So as I'm thinking about that, one of the things I've been hearing more and more, and I think it's fair to say we've been seeing it more and more, is that as technology has advanced, it has helped incentivize kind of this Wild West libertarian world just by the sheer nature that it's new and it hasn't been regulated yet. And one of the best examples I heard most recently was actually the head of the We Are Libertarians channel, Chris Spangle. He was over on Kostaki Economopoulos, who's a very noted stand-up comedian. He was over on his show, and Chris used the example of the internet. And he said, back when in the 90s, when the internet really took off, it was kind of the Wild West, and you got to see it created so much opportunity for innovation, for research and development, but also
the whole blogosphere back when blogs were a thing,
Yeah, exactly. And that right there kind of speaks to, well, sometimes the whatever the libertarian solution or what we think the future will look like, we have no idea, because the market is a sneaky little bugger and it will go ahead and make its own rules. What we think it's going to be damned, and it ends up in some cases, I would say, making some of the original government responsibilities more archaic, right? So very quickly, you can even look at something like the Postal Service. The Postal Service was essentially deemed completely null and void from a service standpoint, if you're really being real with what it's supposed to do, with the advent of email, and the advent of email entirely from the internet. So I hear that argument from some folks who are more in the, well, listen, as we are making this, progression away from government doing these services, if you will, to the market doing these services, I guess let me ask you this. How would we help our friends more on the left? To your point, they're kind of stuck in this mentality that this is the way that we need to live and rule society. But as we show them, if we look right now, there was a whole argument back a couple of months ago about the post office being funded, right? Yeah. And one of the arguments from a more free market perspective was, no, it's not necessary. So is there a way, I guess, that we can kind of take your approach of building the trust, right, in some of these institutions that we can argue are done more from this, this, again, bleeding heart mentality, but as the technology advances to say, hey, listen, this program, it's no longer needed. We've got this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I have a discussion in chapter 5 of the book where I talk about, this is a philosopher's term, policy epistemology, which basically what are the standards that help us to convince each other that some policy is going to have some predicted effect. And there has to be some kind of public way. Sorry. There has to be some kind of public way to convince people of different perspectives that policies have had certain effects. Otherwise, we can't even have discourse about them because we don't even agree about the empirical facts. So what we need at the very least is some kind of cost-benefit analysis test, right? Like how much money is it going to cost? How much money is it going to save? So on and so forth. But if you look at what, say, the Congressional Budget Office says, is they say, well, we score things before they're passed, but then they change when they're passed. So it's actually really hard for us to know whether any policy has been scored correctly. Which I think that many on the left would not want to hear that. But it's pretty much what they say. And what this means is that it's going to be really hard to predict the effects of any policy. And that many people, and the difficulty is if the policy leads, say, to more corruption, right? Or the policy leads to some group imposing its values on a group that rejects those values, then we're going to be in a worse place, even from a left-wing perspective. Now, the difficulty many people on the left say is they say, look, well, you've biased this public reason view towards libertarianism because you're insisting that these policies meet certain standards of evidence They would never put it that way, because as soon as you put it that way, it doesn't sound unreasonably libertarian, right? It just says, look, I mean, now I do actually argue in chapter 5 that there are programs like Head Start, but really the one I think that has been the gold standard for redistributive policy is Bolsa Familia in Brazil. It's a policy basically like the mothers get a small cash transfer from the government if they both get their kids vaccinated and send them to school. And it looks like it's reduced a lot of poverty in Brazil. And, it isn't that much of an interference, with people. It doesn't cost that a huge amount to fund. The mothers aren't forced to bring their kids into the system. They make a choice. It's a cash transfer, so they can do with the money what they want. And over 40 countries have replicated such programs. And there's been a lot of research and well done, experimental trials on it. I asked a friend of mine who worked for the World Bank for a while, what was the gold standard of welfare policy? And he said Bolsa Familia. And I thought, okay, I think that there's enough evidence for Bolsa Familia that libertarians can say, okay, people receiving a cash transfer in exchange for vaccination and kids getting their kids educated, like, that's not the end of the world. You know what I mean? And many, we can even say, according to libertarianism, it's not ideal. But these aren't the places to fight progressives.
Right. Yeah.
Well,
right there. Can I really quick address that? Because that's, I think, that's the elephant in the room, is that you have to meet people where they're at. And actually, I think it's Scott Horton who says it. Argue the left from the left and argue the right from the right. And you have to, if you're not able to make those kind of common agreements on some fundamental principles, that you can all agree. And I when I'm talking to my friends on the left, I'll always start out with, are monopolies bad? They're like, yes. And I'm like, alrighty then. So let's talk about school choice. And like that right there, like if you can start to build upon these common agreements, now you're not going to, this is the best part that I think a lot of libertarians need to also realize, that the best part of the whole conversation is that you're going to see the moment they're like, damn it, they got me. But you can't call them on it. You have to stop. You got to lean back a little bit, and you just got to let it marinate, because that's going to be the time for them to really have some introspection and think about things. And to your point, if you're completely bypassing that from the onset, and you're going in guns a-blazing, like, let's cut all welfare, and you're saying that to, the folks on the left, they're going to be like, hold up. Like that, you're
a bad person.
Exactly.
You don't care about people.
And then you can't enter any conversations in good faith.
Yeah, then they'll just not believe what you say. I mean, most people ideologically hunker down. The people that are easiest to convince are those who know enough to care, so probably over 15, but are not too old to have made up their mind, so under 25 or maybe even 21. And that's, I think, when most people come to libertarianism or any systematic political ideology. They may drift from there bits and pieces, but when you're trying to convince most people, you need to be able to show that the thing you support is consistent with the values that they hold and will probably hold for most of their lives, right? And that's what I call a kind of public justification. That is, we can justify some law or policy to different perspectives. And if you can make the case to people, and I find that with progressives, as soon as I say, okay, no, I do believe in some social welfare policies that I think are worthwhile, like Bolsa Familia, and then I explain it, and that immediately lowers the temperature of the conversation. So you start off with the thing where maybe it's a concession, right? But then you say, but the difficulty I have with progressives, I could say, is that when everyone gets in office, it seems like they start a war. And I think we know from the Iraq War that that's not so great. Obama tears Libya apart. Clinton, tearing apart the Balkans, with Lyndon Johnson and Vietnam. Skipping Carter, but actually, from a libertarian perspective, Carter was half decent, right, relative to the others. But maybe they're all indecent. But in any event, so you say, look, I mean, this is a common value. We don't want to kill poor innocents in different countries. And then you can start to reason, and then they usually say something along the lines of, well, it's the better of the two options, right? And then you say, well, wouldn't it be great if we had third parties? And then they would say, and they say, look, I don't agree with libertarians about very much. I say, well, that's fine, but like, what about a voting system where you could rank people's votes so that you could vote for a third party as your second or your third choice, right? I mean, some countries have ranked choice voting. Others have parliamentary voting where the party that gets 30% of the vote gets 30% of the seats.
Oh, yeah.
Would you be up for that, even if it meant libertarians have 15% of the House rather than what do we have? A Mash and Massey.
And Massey's not even a registered libertarian.
Yeah, right. So the thought would be, you say, look, I mean, and there probably would be a larger Green Party as well, because a lot of people on the left would defect. So I think we'd have it, it would also, I think, be a populist party. So maybe we'd end up with 5, but only 2 of them would be major. But I find it pretty receptive to that. They say, look, I can respect your opinion enough to think that if you're willing to have more of us around, we're willing to have more of you around. But it takes a lot of work. And when libertarians just yell statist, it's not that different from progressives just yelling racist.
Yeah. No, it's
it doesn't do any good.
Yeah.
It's important to have those conversations. Oh, look, I mean, there's heck, Ayn Rand pointed out, there's a similarity between racism and statism as forms of collectivism. And I think that, but we have to be careful about how we talk to people. And that's something libertarians have known for a long time. I mean, we've known that they have to be careful about talking to people. But I'm thinking of something a little deeper and more principled, which is not just that's the only way you're going to convince them that you're correct, but rather that given they're probably not going to change their minds, this is how you actually come to live with people that aren't libertarian.
That's the point right there. We have to live with each other. Like at the end of the day, they're not going away.
Right. And so one of my arguments, and I say this in Appendix B of the book that's actually free online, that most people, if you bring up the Amish, they're a little skeptical, but the Amish get a lot of exemptions from major policy, right? They get exemption from being required to go to public school, at least after 8th grade. They have exemption from Social Security. And so what I like to ask people is, and they think this is a weird question, but I don't think it's that weird, which is that why can't libertarians have a special status like the Amish do? Why can't libertarians have a reservation as the Native Americans are supposed to have, right? Not what they actually have. Why can't we have some opportunity to try our ideas and, y'all can see how we do, right? And a lot of it's actually seldom that people are just really opposed to that. I find if someone's really opposed to that, you scratch them a little bit more and they're really pretty deeply authoritarian. I mean, if you say, look, we're not going to take over the country, just give us 5 square miles on a warm coast and just leave us be and let's see what we can figure out. And they can say, oh, that's going to turn into a hellhole immediately. We'll say, we'll take that on. I mean, we'll take that risk, right? But just, let our people go, right? So yeah, I mean, this is another thing that I kind of think about libertarians. I think it would be more useful if we thought of each other as a people. That it would help us to develop sort of social bonds and we could actually start to motivate more people to cooperate, to actually bring about more libertarian policies. I mean, we're people with unusual values, but we have a deep commitment to getting along that's special and that we don't always live up to, of course. And libertarianism is not a religion, but it is a kind of ideology, not in the bad sense. And there is a lot of bonding and common friendship within that group. And so what I say is, look, I'm not trying to make you live under a libertarian system. I'm just asking you to give us certain exemptions like people of faith get. I'm a Christian. I believe very strongly in religious exemptions for all, people of all different faiths, right? Well, why not ideological exemptions? Right? Why not political exemptions for people that want to be, held apart? And libertarians are unique because we have a very systematic view that's highly at variance where most people are, right? And so, you can start off by saying, look, if you want to continue to have these policies, fine. That's how you want to live together. And I want to live with you, but what would be wrong with a little more federalism? What would be wrong with a little more decentralization? And I think that's a lot more effective. Now here, I think most of you are probably, your listeners are probably at least somewhat sympathetic to that because we've all talked to people about libertarianism and we all know a little sense about what works and what doesn't. So that's the kind of case that I try to make, that, I'm speaking to their values because I care about them, because I respect them, and then trying to make a case for libertarianism in a way that isn't as threatening to them as I think the sort of standard fare that at least we used to hear more about when Trump hadn't swamped all libertarian discussion. You should have a friend of mine who says that Trump turned everybody against their own group, turned libertarians against libertarians, conservatives against conservatives, and, liberals against liberals. And And, there's all these internal conflicts on the left now about like open society or not, same thing of the conflicts between populists and traditional conservatives on the right. And then there's the libertarians who are kind of with Rand Paul, and they say, look, at least Trump isn't for war. And, we've got it. He sucks in a lot of ways, but we kind of got to throw in with him. He's going to give us, good justices that will help us limit government. That's like way better than what we usually get from Republicans. He's way better than George W. Bush. He hasn't killed hundreds of thousands of people. Like, yes, he's, authoritarian. Yes, he's bigoted in various ways, but like, broadly speaking, he's less of a killer.
Objective good is objective good. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's, but then the folks on the left say, look, he's tearing down the rule of law. He's dividing people. He's causing, polarization. He's eroding norms. Democracy may not be the very best system, but it's the best we've been able to achieve. And he's undermining that. And so I feel like we've just been torn apart. And libertarians, the popular libertarians, I think, are also torn. Like Justin Amash hates Trump, right? Rand Paul really likes Trump. But I like Justin Amash and I like Rand Paul. And I kind of wonder whether Rand hasn't kept Trump from actually intervening a bit more.
Absolutely.
I actually think it's plausible that he's had something of an effect.
Yes.
Whereas, but I think Justin Amash, I mean, if he was actually going to run, I was going to beat down doors for him. I mean, because he's, like me, a pro-life libertarian. And I also have a number of other ridiculous things in common with him. Not that that matters, but libertarians have taken different postures, right? And that's, I think, made us focus more on what divides us and what unites us. That was the great thing about Ron Paul in 2008 and 2012, at least before the newsletter thing became an issue, was that it was bringing us all together. And we did think that maybe the Republican Party would be a good vehicle for our ideas. And you know what? I mean, I'll say this. I actually think that some of Trump's hostility to war isn't native to him. I think he picked a lot of it up. Remember, he ran against Pat Buchanan for the Reform Party presidential ticket in 2000. I think he ended up taking on a lot of Buchanan's views. So I don't think he got it from libertarianism. But there was this kind of milieu that was not always great and sometimes bad, quite bad, but of a discussion among conservatives and libertarians, paleoconservatives and libertarians, about being anti-war. And sometimes I wonder if through some kind of chain of influence, how, we have this president who's done, some pretty bad things abroad, but nothing like Obama, nothing like W, certainly, right? Nothing like Clinton. I mean, so, maybe we do have some kind of effect, but then, we get these immigration restrictions. And I know some libertarians, a few are on board with that. I just think that's a mistake. I also know most libertarians are pro-choice, so maybe they think I'm mistaken for being pro-life. But the broader point is just that right now libertarians are so divided that it's hard for us to accomplish anything with two shining exceptions. We're winning on marijuana and we're winning on school choice. So, and school choice, I'm convinced, is going to matter more than all of it, right? Because kids are going to grow up with lots of different ideas. They're not going to be as homogenized. Also have read some stuff on there's some evidence now that a lot of secularization occurs because of public schooling, because it takes you away from encountering diverse and different and religious values that you might have, because you're just stuck in a public school all day, right? Like you're just focused on whatever the other kids are and whatever the teacher forces you to do. And I also think, and I know many libertarians disagree with me on this, but the new atheism has faded a lot. And, Ayn Rand was a new atheist before it was cool. Is that actually because religious people have other loyalties? They're not always, they're not always collectivist and trying to control people, right? I mean, in our personal life, Ayn Rand was a lot more controlling than almost every religious person I know. And I think that, libertarians know, and many don't like this, but that it's just something that Rothbard understood. He just didn't take it always or usually in the right direction. There had to be an alliance with people of faith. And if the country becomes more religious, stops its decline, I think fewer people will be reaching out to, ideological Trumpism, but also this sort of ideological social justice attitude. So I think, school choice is going to open up a lot of doors for us.
Yeah. No, I agree. Corey DeAngelis over at the Reason Foundation has been doing amazing work. And I mean, like, Trump's retweeting him. That's a big deal. Like, that cannot be understated, that the president of the United States is retweeting a libertarian think tank's entire pro-school choice public policy approach. Like, okay, I see why folks like Austin Peterson are voting for Trump. I understand the appeal because there definitely are some pro-libertarian sentiments. I mean, goodness, the criminal justice reform bill that Trump passed for the first, I mean, that's a big deal. And like, that's an objective thing that not only libertarians, but like, I think by and large, just people across the nation can say like, that's a good thing. Like, and that there's a reason that Biden's walking away from the 94 crime bill, because it's been objectively looked at as a negative. And like, that's okay. We need to embrace that. That's the reality. And we can agree with people on the left. And I don't understand this, again, it goes to this kind of collective appeal. It seems like we have to be the left versus the right. And I'm guilty of it myself. I've gone on and said, the left, and I usually use it for talking about people who don't have a conversation more so than just like the generic left. But like, there are some folks on the hardcore left who they will not have conversations, and they do label everybody that's, right of Marx as racist. And it's hard to have conversations with folks like that. But to the contrary, you have, your super, racist Nazi, I'm not gonna say Proud Boy, because I want to, lump them in, because I know that they're not the same, but like, you'll have these far right ideological groups that they'll do the exact same thing that Antifa does, right? They'll get into their little, their little collective hive, and that groupthink, it's very toxic. It's very dangerous.
It's also groupthink is bad among libertarians. It's bad for everybody.
For sure. No, it's terrible. And like, that's one thing I think we as libertarians also need to do, is lead by example. Get out of our online think tanks of group chats and stuff. And
we got to be more than argument bots.
Yes, get to talk to real people, and also get offline. Get like, I have a really good friend, and like, bless his soul, he lives at home with his parents. Like, he plays video games all day long, and like, his entire worldview is through the confines of his computer screen. And like, he thinks the world is a terrible place. And I'm like, my man, of course, when you surround yourself online with people who think the exact same way as you, and you only look for things that reaffirm that worldview, that you're going to have a negative view. And then the best part, the worst part is that they don't have a job. They don't go out and see the real world. And like it's very damaging to your psychological self, because if you're, and this goes even more to like, we want, this would open up another can of worms, but like the damaging impacts of the lockdowns, I would say, from a top down perspective, like putting people in these bubbles where your entire interaction with the outside world is through screens. I just don't think it's healthy. And I don't think it's necessarily real. I don't think like
it will have some negative, it will have some costs, big ones, but I'm in a place on all of this of deep agnosticism. My advisor, Jerry Gasser, I mentioned, I'm talking about him so much because he died 2 months ago. And he was finishing up a book that's going to come out called The Open Society and Its Complexities. And one of the things that he stresses, and this is a theme in Hayek's later work, is just that economic systems and political systems are complex and not just complicated, meaning that they have lots of different moving parts that have causal feedback loops with one another. And so that makes it very, very hard to predict outcomes. And this is something Jerry was talking about with COVID, in some of his public talks, was that our inability to predict outcomes with the models has been really embarrassingly bad. So early on, I was like, okay, 14 days to stop the spread or whatever. But like, even now, like the libertarians that are so anti-lockdown, I feel like it's like the same thing. It's like everyone feels more certain about what to do than I do. Like, I feel like I feel like people want me to have, like, people I know, like, oh, you're a political philosopher, what do you think? And I'm like, look, I don't know what the best policy is right now. I just don't know. I keep hoping they'll come up with a vaccine. I'm going to get it early. I know that. I want to contribute to the public good with a voluntary action, and that's a very good way to do it. But all the anti-lockdown libertarians, but also I do think there's, early on, a lot of the libertarians that were pro-lockdown were louder, you know what I mean? But now it's the anti-lockdown libertarians.
And candidly, by the way, I am 1,000% anti-lockdown libertarian. Like I have been from the start. I had Dan Mitchell on my show back in March, and like we were talking about the economic consequences of the COVID-19 lockdowns from an economic standpoint then. And actually, I was just saying I had Jeffrey Tucker from AIR, which just played. Yes.
He's been all over it.
He sure has.
I used to agree with Jeff about many things, but I've come to disagree with him in his degree of certitude about the badness of these. Now, what I think is going to happen, what I would support is I don't think we need lockdowns, and in fact, I think there's good evidence to suggest that it's actually the lockdowns, temporary lockdowns, actually aren't the worst thing for the economy. The worst thing for the economy is people are afraid to exchange with each other. That's been the biggest hit. So I don't know if lockdowns aren't the source of the greatest economic cost. The 80-90% of it, I think, is just people are afraid to exchange. And so what we need as soon as possible, and this is where I'm with Tyler Count and Alex Tabarrok, because they've been banging the drum on this, is if another country comes up with a vaccine and they're a decent country with good health professionals like the UK, why should we wait for our own FDA? If the UK FDA says it's good enough, well, theirs is called something different, then why shouldn't we have the freedom to try it? So Alex has been on the, reimportation of drugs. Like, why can't we reimport drugs from Canada and England and Sweden and stuff? Do you think that they just make stupid decisions? But actually our FDA is actually really regressive. It's way too risk averse and controlling. And so, my view is, I say I try to respect expert opinion, but they were so badly wrong, and particularly when the hypocrisy that came up with, people can protest and that's fine, but they can't go to church. Yeah, so for me, as a person of faith who couldn't go to church but once a month, who had to not receive the sacraments because I didn't want to get people sick, but then all these other people can pursue what their highest value is, right? But I can't. So my little church can't get together. I sing in church too. I can't sing very well. We have to all be in the front pew, but we finally got permission to be back up in the choir loft. And it's just the amount of consolation and joy that comes from that's overwhelming. So as soon as the main people wouldn't say, oh, well, you shouldn't be protesting, I was like, I think I'm done listening to you. Now that doesn't mean I'm going to go hardcore in the other direction. It just means I don't know. And I really wish that the leading medical professionals had the courage to say that the protests were a risk and that people should reconsider, but they lacked it, and that made me trust them less because they had less courage.
You said it. Trust. Yeah. And that's full circle. Trust in a polarized age. I mean, my goodness, how about that for a nice bow on top of the episode? Because that's exactly what it comes down to. Trust is missing, right. And we need to reestablish some form of trust in politics, especially, in this polarized age. The book is available November 10th, and between now and then, Kevin Vallier, where can folks go ahead and follow you to stay up to date with all that's happening in your world? And when folks want to go ahead and buy the book, we're going to go ahead and find it.
Well, friend me on Facebook. It's just find me at Kevin Vallier. The name will be in the show, but it's V as in Victor, ALLIER, as I like to say. But there's my website, kevinvallier.com, that you can go to, which has the book page and links to the book and links to discounts on the book. So you can get my book for $25. I spent a lot of time on the data on trust, but there's a lot of things that I think are cool about the relationship between how markets build trust and how trust builds markets that I think a lot of your listeners will find of interest. So check out me on Facebook. I'm at K Vallier on Twitter. You can follow me there. And then, of course, there's my website. So you can find me in any of those places.
Fantastic. And I'll make sure I include all those links in the show notes. Kevin Vallier, thanks for another Brian Nichols Show.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, folks, that's going to wrap up today's episode. Right now, things are so intense, so polarized. It's so important for us to have this conversation and to be able to talk to one another. And I say that as someone, I have got to get better at that and definitely have to work on some grudges and some past things that have happened over the past few years that have definitely irked me, and I'm sure many of you out there as well with the COVID insanity. So I think this is a great step forward for us to try and find a way to trust one another. And if you think so, well, do me a favor, go ahead and share today's episode. And when you do, go ahead and tag yours truly at B Nichols Liberty. And also, you can go ahead and support the show. I know I'm going to tell you a secret. There's a couple different ways. I don't mean to get creepy like Joe Biden there, but here, not creepy like Joe Biden. No, I'm going to tell you a secret, kid. Now, I'm actually going to tell you a secret, though, about a way you can save some money, but also support the show. Number one, briannicholsshow.com/shop. Head there. You will be redirected to our amazing sponsor and cohort here at the Brian Nichols Show. That is our good friends over at Proud Libertarian. They host the shop here at the Brian Nichols Show, where you're going to go ahead and find so many awesome items that you yourself can rock, but also will make some great holiday gifts as well. From our What Happened in 1971 to our Magic Money Tree shirts. Now that's what I call Tyranny Klaus Schwab shirt, Liberty Legends, and more. You can find so many awesome items over at our shop at briannicholsshow.com/shop. And all I ask for you to do is just do yourself the favor and use code TBNS at checkout, and you will have a discount applied to your order at the end there. And by the way, if you want to just go ahead and support the show, you can go ahead and do that at briannicholsshow.com/support. Make a one-time donation or become a recurring donor, $5 a month, whatever it may be. I greatly appreciate it. Again, briannicholsshow.com/support. And then on a final note, we've had some awesome episodes here on the program the past couple of weeks, past couple of months. Yesterday, we had a great conversation with Ben Carlisle. He is an attorney out of New York, and he is doing great things helping COVID vaccine. So folks who were impacted negatively by the COVID vaccine shots, if they were forced to take it by their employers, well, he's going to give you a chance to go ahead and get workers' compensation and actually find a means to get some justice here, which thank goodness that there are folks like him out there actually fighting the good fight, particularly in really blue states like New York. So I'll go ahead and include that right here below if you're joining us on the video version of the program. And yeah, if you're missing out on the video version of the program, we'll head over to briannicholsshow.com, where, yes, you can find today's episode, including the transcript from today's episode, plus all the links as we talked about in the episode. But also you can go ahead and find all the different video versions of the show here on YouTube, Rumble, and on Odyssey. All I ask is you do me a favor. Please, when you're there, just hit that magic subscribe button and little notification bell so you don't miss a single time we go live. And with that being said, yeah, we have some awesome episodes here as we wrap up the week. Mark Lobliner, IFBB Pro, and he's a great friend and an awesome guy over at Tiger Fitness. He's returning to the program, as well as Maj Torre from Black Guns Matter. We have some awesome episodes lined up here for you, so make sure you hit that subscribe button so you're not missing a single one as they go live. But with that being said, it's Brian Nichols signing off here on The Brian Nichols Show. We'll see you tomorrow.
For listening to The Brian Nichols Show. Find more episodes at briannicholsshow.com.